Hello, welcome to News Decoder's session webinar on the Arab Spring and the Middle East with Professor Rami Khouri. My name is Nelson Graves, and I'm speaking to you from Paris, France, and I'm joined on camera with, in New York, sorry, by Professor Rami Khouri. One second. Hello, Professor Khouri, how are you?
Hi, glad to be with you. Thank you.
And in Jordan, we have students and faculty from King's Academy. Hello, King's Academy.
Hello. Hello.
Terrific. This is News Decoder's second webinar of the new academic year. Last week we had human rights expert Steve Crawshaw from London. And today we tackle another hugely pressing international issue, the future of the Middle East, with another world-renowned expert, Professor Rami Khouri. Now, before I introduce Professor Khouri, a word on today's session. We like these webinars to be as interactive as possible, and students and faculty at King's Academy in Jordan will be able to intervene at any time to ask questions or to make comments. Those of you who are watching the session from elsewhere have a chat room on your screen that you can use to submit questions or make comments. Please take advantage of this chat room to intervene at any time. We strongly encourage you to do so that the session is interactive. Now on to our guest. I can't think of anyone better placed to speak about the roots of the Arab Spring or the future of the Middle East than Rami Khouri. Professor Khouri comes from the region. He's studied the region and he's observed the main actors. To mix metaphors, ships lie, and he has no axe to grind. He has a scholarly viewpoint that's tempered with on-the-ground experience. And true to News Decoder's mission, he can present multiple perspectives. Born in New York City, Professor Khouri has passports from Jordan and the United States, and he lives in Beirut. This term, he's a fellow at Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Clearly, his thinking and teaching transcend international boundaries. Professor Khouri is a senior fellow at the American University of Beirut and a non-resident senior fellow at Harvard. He writes an internationally syndicated political column, and he's a columnist and editor-at-large for the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut. An author of books and newspaper and magazine articles, Khouri was awarded the Pax Christi International Peace Prize for 2006. He's been a fellow and a visiting scholar at Harvard, Princeton, Mount Holyoke, Syracuse University, Tufts, the University of Oklahoma, and Stanford. And he was a member of the Brookings Institution Task Force on U.S. Relations and the Islamic World. Wow, that's something. Rami, over to you, please.
Thank you, Nelson. I'm very happy to be with you. I'm very happy to have the King's Academy online with us. I have lived and worked in Jordan for about 30 years at one stretch before I moved to Lebanon about 13 years ago. And I remember when the King's Academy started and other private schools started, and the quality education that people get there from these private schools, as well as some of the fine public ones, is one of the things that sets Jordan apart from other places in the Arab world. So it's a real pleasure for me to interact with students and teachers there. And I think it is probably the single most important dynamic that we need to promote in the Arab world, which is to have young people in school or out of school encouraged and promoted to use their mind, not only to learn things, but to engage in discussions and conversations and debates. And yesterday, Jordan had an election. There wasn't a very high turnout, but still, this is a process that is ongoing as these Arab countries evolve slowly into more participatory, democratic, and accountable political systems. And the absolute linchpin for success for this kind of process is an educated, aware, and dynamic citizenry. To have citizens, especially younger people, who are able and willing to participate in the public discussions, in discussions at school, in the workplace, on the football field, wherever they may be, to talk with their fellow citizens peacefully and openly and pluralistically, and then participate in decision-making through elections, through other processes. So I'm very happy to be with you today and play whatever small role I can in these discussions. I would just make one or two quick comments that we really have two major challenges facing us in the Middle East and the Arab world, as well as globally. I've spent the last 50 years, since 1966, exactly 50 years, writing about the Middle East as a journalist. I started in 1966 in college, and as of 1970, I was back in Lebanon and Jordan and have been in the Middle East since then. And what I've seen happen over the last 50 years has been a rather troubling tendency for polarization to happen within the Middle East and within the Western world. And you see it in the elections in Europe and in the United States. You see it in the polarization and tensions across the Arab world and Iran and other places. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, everywhere there's polarization, there's tension, and there's military confrontations. So we have to address this broader problem of individuals, groups in society, and entire countries becoming more polarized, more contentious, more combative, and in some cases militarily actually engaged in combat with one another. And that's on a sort of regional and global level. Within Arab countries, the big challenge is to really promote more participatory, democratic, and accountable political systems, political governance systems. The seeds of participation and accountability are deeply embedded in Arab culture, in Islamic culture, in Middle Eastern tribal culture. Anywhere you look in the Arab world, I wrote about this for years when I was in Jordan. I used to write about archaeology, among other things. And you see this going back thousands of years. Local communities, whether at a village level or a country or region, with mechanisms whereby individual citizens could make their feelings known and could hold power accountable without a formal American or British-style democratic system. So our challenge in the Arab world is to enhance those mechanisms of participation by ordinary citizens, which means freedom of speech, the ability to speak out openly and honestly and responsibly and accurately, as well as participation. So if somebody does something in government that's illegal or corrupt or unacceptable ethically, there must be mechanisms for citizens to challenge that and bring order to these kinds of situations. So that's the big challenge internally in the Arab world, is to generate more participatory and accountable governance systems. The election in Jordan was a small step in that direction. It's going very slowly, and it's going to take a lot longer. It took the Western world about 500 years to go from the Magna Carta to the French Revolution. So, you know, they didn't do it in 20 years either. So we know this is a slow process, but the important thing is to keep it going. And perhaps one of the most critical things in this process is for young people like students and their teachers in high schools to keep pushing that process forward responsibly but credibly as well. So I think these are the two big challenges: good governance internally in the Arab world, and that will bring about economic development and prosperity and rule of law and all the good things we want, environmental protection, all the challenges we face in the Arab world. And the second thing is to re-engage somehow more responsibly between the Arab world and non-Arab people, whether it's Israelis and Turks and Iranians or people in the region, or it's people in the Western world or in the East or in Russia or wherever it may be. Those are two huge challenges, but they're also challenges that are universal. And these challenges have been met in other societies that were equally stressed out. If you look at countries like, I don't know, South Korea or Taiwan or Indonesia or Singapore 50 years ago, or South Africa or Northern Ireland, and look at them today, well, they're pretty impressive. And they overcame those same challenges that we're facing. So it can be done. We have the moral, spiritual, ethical, and personal values in the Arab Islamic world to do that. And I'm hoping that the next generation of young people will play a strong, clear role in that process. And thank you to Nelson and his colleagues for being in a position to allow us to interact like this and to discuss these issues and improve the well-being of all of our world, hopefully, inshallah.
Terrific. The students in Jordan are particularly well placed to ask you questions about the electoral process and democracy in the Arab world, of course. And we'll turn over to them shortly. If I could just take the liberty of asking the first question as we open the Q&A. In a speech that you made last year in South Africa, you attributed the Arab Spring to pent-up grievances that stemmed in part from the absence of what you've already discussed, the social contract between citizens and government. I'm simplifying what you said, but that is certainly one of the grievances that you cited as a source of the Arab Spring. My question then is, what needs to be done to establish such a social contract between the citizens and their government? What would such a social contract look like? What would it consist of? And can the citizens wait? I mean, you've mentioned that it was 500 years between the Magna Carta and the French Revolution. I don't think people are going to wait 500 years for this contract between citizens and government in the Arab world or in the Middle East more broadly. So how long can the citizens wait, and what will this contract look like once it's in place?
Well, I would say, first of all, that people will wait only as long as they need to wait based on the circumstances that they are able to influence. So this is not a process that is managed by somebody else and they're just passive observers. The Arab citizens in Jordan and Syria and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, everywhere, the Arab citizens are the ones who will determine how quickly this process will develop. And it's moving ahead in some countries, and in other countries it's not moving, and in some places it's moving backwards with warfare and fragmentation. And so we have a lot of problems, but there are also positive signs in the Arab world. So the critical, the most important single dynamic, as far as I have observed in my last 50 years of living and writing about the Arab world, is there must be a space in our societies for ordinary citizens, however humble and simple or rich and famous and powerful and anything in between. There must be space for ordinary people simply to speak out honestly. If somebody is mistreated by a private business firm, if somebody is mistreated by a public official, a security officer, a colleague on the sports field, if something unethical or illegal happens, citizens must be able to speak out and get a redress of grievance, and citizens also must be able to give their opinion and give their views. There are a lot of challenges in our societies: environmental, economic, labor, youth, women, all kinds of challenges. All of them are fixable. They're all problems that have come about because of decisions by human beings. They're not acts of God or acts of nature. They can be fixed by good human behavior and good governance, and citizens must be involved in that process. So citizens must contribute to the ideas and the dynamics that will fix some of the stresses we have and build on the successes that we've already achieved. So the absolute bottom line is, I think, freedom of speech, freedom of expression within the rule of law. I gave a talk at the Schumann Foundation in Amman a couple of months ago about this. It's on their website if anybody wants to go see it. The rule of law to work must have open public sphere, that citizens must be able to speak, and officials and civil society, the private sector, everybody in society. So that's what I would say is number one priority. And then a process of interaction in society will happen, and the citizens themselves in every country will determine how fast they move and in which direction they move. Some Arab countries will have a little bit more tribal societies. Some of them will have monarchies. Some of them will have republics. Some of them will have Islamic shaped institutions. Some of them will have Arab nationalist institutions. Some will plug into the global capitalist value system. These are all valid contexts. Each one of these is absolutely valid, and it's for each society to determine the mix of those things that it wants. So if we want something from Sharia law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations Charter and something else, and we put them together in a way that satisfies us in Jordan or in Morocco or somewhere else, that's what citizenship is all about, and that's what responsible governance is all about. So I think the critical thing is to have the space for people to speak out and participate, and then the process will define itself according to local values and local priorities.
Great. Before turning over to Kings for their questions, and I see we already have a couple on chat, which is a good sign, I wanted to turn to the region's most pressing issue, current events, Syria, and specifically about the Islamic State group. How can ISIS be defeated? You've made the point in your writing that the way you've put it, I think, is very poignant. You said that the midwives of ISIS cannot also be its pallbearers. And by that, you mean that autocratic Arab regimes on the one hand and Western militarism on the other are working to defeat ISIS, but they're also partly responsible for it. So in your view, what is the answer to ISIS? Can the region wait long enough for the roots for ISIS to be destroyed, or can something be done more quickly?
We have to identify and deal with the roots of the creation and persistence of ISIS. ISIS is a small movement of thugs and criminals. There are some people in ISIS who are genuine believers in the creation of a caliphate, and many Muslims would probably welcome a caliphate if it's following traditional Islamic values. These guys are criminals, and most Muslims in the world, the overwhelming majority, reject them for what they are. So I think you have to defeat the institutions that they've created, break them up in Raqqa and in Mosul and other places. That's being done right now. It'll be done in the next 9 months, and we will not have ISIS as a structure and a movement that controls territory. I think by next year, this time, ISIS probably won't exist in that form. The problem is that that's not the real challenge of ISIS. The real challenge of ISIS is to understand what are the driving forces in society, the underlying social, economic, political, historical, ideological, environmental, all the many different forces and reasons in society that cause people to say they like ISIS or they support or they understand why ISIS is, some of them say ISIS is defending Sunni Islam and stuff like this, which most people, including myself, think is criminal nonsense. But there are lots of people who support ISIS and who like what it's doing. And that's not because ISIS is so great, it's because the conditions in people's lives have become so difficult that they reach out, and even they find ISIS as a source of help to them that can improve their lives. So this requires a really strong level of honesty, courageous, honest analysis, saying, well, why should ordinary, decent people in Aleppo, in Casablanca, in Ma'an and Mafra and Zarqa, where ISIS started with Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, why would ordinary, decent, middle-class people suddenly reach a point where they go and support ISIS? And that's a process of a human evolution. It's very clear, it's very obvious, anybody who studies it. I've spent the last year researching why people actually like or support ISIS, and I've got a list of around 85 different reasons, and this is why defeating ISIS is so hard, because
what are the main reasons I missed?
Well, if you categorize them, the main reasons are simply that people feel vulnerable, they feel marginalized, they feel hopeless, and ISIS gives them a sense of empowerment, of power, of purpose in life, of creating a society that they see ideally as a perfect, just Islamic society. A lot of this is romanticized, but a lot of it is just desperation, where a young man or woman with a family of 4 or 5 kids, and they have no money to feed these kids. So this man can go and join ISIS, get $400 a month, and save their family. So you have material issues, you have political issues, you have, there's so many of them. This is why it's so difficult. But it's fundamentally about vulnerability, marginalization, and poverty and helplessness among lots of people in the Arab world. And this is essentially an Arab problem, because the heart of ISIS came from the Arab world, from Egypt, from Syria, from Iraq, from Jordan, from Saudi Arabia, people from these countries. And many of them were radicalized in jail. And many of them were radicalized because of Western military action in Iraq and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and other places. So there's a lot of different reasons. I don't justify any of them. I think ISIS is a criminal terrorist group, but we will only defeat it by understanding what brought them to life. And this means the underlying drivers, which are so complicated, and if people go to my website, they'll, which is on the screen, I think, they can see my columns that I've written about this. And there's a lot of clarity now about why people are attracted to ISIS. And what's really troubling is that, you know, serious research, including in Jordan and other places, that's been done by serious scholars and analysts and pollsters, tells us that somewhere between 4 and 10% of people across the Arab region think positively about ISIS. They think it's a good thing. They understand what it's doing. So they may not join it, but they have a positive reaction to it. You know, 10% of the Arab world is 40 million people. And 4% of the Arab world is just under 20 million. There's 18 million people or something. That's a lot of people. Of course, you only have about, I don't know, 50 or 100,000 people who've gone off and joined ISIS. But if you have millions, tens of millions, who emotionally are inclined to think positively of what ISIS is doing, it's because the conditions in their lives are so difficult. And that gets you back to things like the quality of education, the unemployment rates, the lack of social protection. You know, about 45% of people in high school and primary school in the Arab world are not learning anything. They can't read or write or do numeracy. And they're going to drop out, and they're going to have no life other than shining shoes or sweeping somebody's floor or washing dishes somewhere. Or picking tomatoes on a farm with no social protection, no insurance. So this is the problem: human vulnerability, and this can be addressed by good economic growth, good governance, and real citizenship.
So what you're saying, Professor Khouri, is that militarily ISIS can be defeated in the short term. I think you've said that as much, but that over the longer term, to eradicate them, you have to tackle the roots.
Yes.
Are the regimes in the Arab world up to the task, do you think, over the longer term?
They could be, but they haven't shown signs yet of a really serious, credible process to do that. They talk about it, and I think one of the problems we have, and I'm in the US now, and I'm talking to people here who are involved in what they call countering violent extremism and stuff. Too much emphasis is placed on things like, you know, we need to promote moderate Islam. We need to counter the narrative of ISIS on Twitter. Those are all symptoms. People are reacting to the symptoms, and they're not addressing the underlying issues. Like this guy who just committed these bombs in New York, the Afghan-American guy, suddenly yesterday the New York Times investigated, and they said, oh, his friend said that he suddenly turned religious. He suddenly became more Islamic. And of course, in the American mind, unfortunately, that means he became more violent. But the reality is that people become more religious when they're oppressed and they seek protection, just like Martin Luther King and his followers became more religious when they were subjugated as Black Americans in the 1950s and mistreated, and religion was their protection and their salvation, and it helped them mobilize to live a better life. So a lot of people who become more Islamic, suddenly it's because they're living really difficult lives, and there's nobody other than God who can give them hope and give them a sense of justice. So, and of course, a few people become violent and they use terrorism, but most people who adopt more religious positions are doing so because religion is the only thing left for them to hold on to. And therefore, I think we need to in the Western world, in the Arab world, and other places, people need to go deeper than the superficial surface manifestations of a woman, more women wearing scarves, more men growing beards. I mean, these are symptoms, these are outward signs. The underlying reason is people become more religious, they become more conservative because they have no other hope to protect themselves. And therefore, the longer term strategy is really hard. It takes a long time, but it's doable. It's to promote better governance, economic growth, social equity, social justice. These are things that are deeply entrenched in Arab Islamic values and society. So there shouldn't be a problem. I think what we need is, again, what I said in the beginning, citizens must demand these things and participate in bringing them about in peaceful, credible, legitimate ways. Jordan is one of the countries that allows this to happen. There's other Arab countries where you can't do that. And, conservative Arab countries and some monarchies and others, you're not allowed to create an NGO or a civil society group. In Jordan, you can. You can write in the press. You can create a society to promote democracy among women or to promote activism among young students. So Jordan is lucky in that it has the space in which people can do this. But it is a long-term process. And the critical first step, other than what I said before, having an open sphere for people to speak out, is the average citizen must feel that he or she can actually improve their lives and their children's lives by being engaged politically and socially, that their activism can bring about the changes that they want.
Let's turn it over to Kings. I see there's some questions on chat, and you yourselves may have some questions. Sorry, you want to ask the first question from Jordan?
Of course. My question is mainly based about the column I read written by...
I can't hear you very well. Can you get closer to the mic, maybe?
Can you hear me now, Professor Khouri?
It's a bit low, but just raise your voice, maybe.
Okay, let me bring it closer a bit. Hello?
Yeah.
How about this?
That's much better.
All right. Apologies for that. In your written report about many early warning signs singled current Arab history, you wrote it in August 3rd. You mentioned that one of the fifth fact is, and I'm quoting you here, you mentioned that simultaneously a large number of Arab citizens by the early 2000s were expressing pessimism about their future well-being in terms of material needs, jobs, income, healthcare, or political rights and opportunities for self-improvement. Nationals of wealthy oil producers who enjoyed welfare still benefits remained the exception. Now, in the Middle East, we see that the only kind of surviving country is Jordan. However, Jordan still does not have a great job market or a great income, and the citizens are still pessimistic about the opportunities provided by them. For example, the unemployment rate is 14.7. So how do you think this is, looking at Jordan, how do you think Jordan is still functioning in the Middle East with all the surrounding countries being in a disturbed situation?
Well, I think the lessons of Jordan are really interesting and relevant. And the fact that it has maintained both stability and certain minimum standards of human development. For instance, almost every Jordanian today can probably physically walk on their feet to a local health center or have access to clean water. That's pretty impressive for a country without much money or natural resources historically. So Jordan has achieved a lot. And the reason it has done that has been, I think, the combination of positioning itself in a way that everybody in the world, literally, practically everybody in the world except for ISIS, wants Jordan to survive and to prosper. Arabs, Turks, Israelis, Americans, everybody wants to support Jordan because they understand its important strategic role in the region and its possible model as a developmental state. The shortcoming is, as you mentioned, that unemployment rate you mentioned, by the way, has changed very little since I was sitting where you were sitting 40 years ago. or 45 years ago. In the 70s, I remember, unemployment was 15%, and youth unemployment was 25%, 30%, and they're still the same. And there's been massive efforts by the government and the World Bank and UN and everybody to try to improve this, and they haven't been able to do it. So what you need to do in the first instance in Jordan, I think, is the government with the private sector, with civil society, for people to sit together and honestly ask themselves, why have we not been able to bring the unemployment down for the last 40 years? While we're getting from the world community $1.5 billion or whatever it is of aid every year. So there's a problem in the policies that Jordan has been implementing that have been able to impact on a large scale on employment and prosperity in the same way that, for instance, South Korea or Taiwan or Indonesia or Singapore were able to create prosperity and jobs over the long run. So I think Jordan's strengths are very important to understand. Decent, good leadership, participation by the private sector, involvement by civil society. All of these are strong, important elements, but they haven't tackled the key challenge yet. And this is perplexing. And I think this is the challenge we pass on to you as the next generation to figure out how to do it better than we did.
We have a question, Professor Khouri, from the Princeton International School of Mathematics and Science, just down the New Jersey Turnpike from you in Princeton, New Jersey. And the question is this, actually we have two questions from them. Their first question is, what role can the United States play in promoting peace in the Middle East? Simple question.
Well, it has a simple answer. Practice what you preach. The United States has spoken eloquently about the rule of law, about justice, equal rights, implementing UN resolutions, anything that you want in the world. The U.S. has spoken very eloquently, including 2 days ago at the UN, or yesterday, the American president was saying something like, Israel cannot forever expect to occupy Arab lands. But then the American president gives Israel $37 billion in 10-year guaranteed, $37 billion with a B. So if the U.S. is saying one thing, but doing something else, and not actually using its power and influence to bring about the kinds of issues that it speaks about rhetorically: justice, peace, equality, stability, etc. Supporting autocratic leaders in different Arab countries. Egypt particularly comes to mind, and other places. So these are problems that the U.S. has to address itself. If it wants to be respected, if it wants to be effective, if it really wants to live in a world of peace, it needs to implement on the ground what it actually talks about rhetorically. And that hasn't been the case. So that's one issue. But this is not the problem of the United States. The problems of the Middle East are a combination of poor governance in many Arab countries, the impact of 70 years of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict is central to this issue of the problems that we have, the instability, and continuous and ongoing now military interference by foreign powers. Historically, of course, the British were bombing Iraq in the 1920s, and they're still bombing Iraq today. The Americans are doing it. The Russians are there. The Iranians are there. The Saudis are in Yemen. The Turks are. Everybody's bombing everybody anywhere they want in the Middle East. It's crazy. This doesn't happen in South Asia. It doesn't happen in South America, but it happens in our region. So there's a structural, real problem in the relationship politically and militarily between foreign powers and Arab countries. And it's up to us in the Arab world to turn this around. And if we take the lead in better governance and more effective policies, foreign countries will respect us more and follow us more. So the U.S. should practice what it preaches and be more aware of the sentiments of ordinary Arab citizens, and not just deal with small elites all over the place, because the uprisings of 6 years ago, 2011, were an incredible sign of mass discontent and fear, and real fear and vulnerability. Ordinary people felt their future was black, and then they rose up. There's lots of signs we've had that change is needed, that lots and lots of people want change in the Arab world, and that we can achieve it. Tunisia is the first breakthrough to a democratic, pluralistic, and constitutional system, and others we hope will follow.
You've mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian, the protracted Israeli-Palestinian issue as being crucial. You also mentioned the rather large, actually record size aid, military aid package, which the U.S. Has just announced for Israel. What should the U.S.'s policy, in your view, be towards Israel? Surely you're not suggesting that they shouldn't give any aid, but what steps do you think the U.S. should be taking to finally bring peace to that region and help with the difficulties in the broader region?
The U.S. has a special role to play in Arab-Israeli peacemaking because it's the only country that the Palestinians and the Arabs and the Israelis actually want to be involved and respect and count on to help them achieve and maintain a peace. So it does have a bigger role than, say, Russia or France or anybody else. So what the United States should do, I think, given the failure of the last 20 years of its mediating direct negotiations, they've completely failed with their current approach, and they should just drop it. What the U.S. should do is harness an international coalition of countries in the region, in the West, in the Islamic world, all over the place, to come together and do for the Arabs and the Israelis what the world just did for the Iranian situation, which is to make a negotiation that is anchored in international law, common ethical systems that we all adhere to, the rights of both sides implemented simultaneously and equally. Not the Israelis get security and then we see what crumbs the Palestinians get, but equally and simultaneously, Palestine and Israel and the other Arab countries with occupied lands all get their rights, adhering to the rule of law that is clearly stated in UN resolutions and international law and conventions. The Iran negotiations were a tremendous example of what the US could actually do with the P5+1 process with other countries involved. And it was a great example of how to tackle tough issues. The answers are there in UN resolutions and the international rule of law. What we need is an American leadership that can understand the importance of applying to the Arab-Israeli conflict the same principles of negotiating a permanent, fair, equitable agreement as it just did in Iran. And there would be massive support for this all over the world.
Over to Kings. I think there's a question, there's a question from chat, actually from American University in Washington relating to Saudi Arabia. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll have here my fellow introduce herself and introduce the question. So I'll give it to Bushra.
Hello, Professor Khouri and Dr. Nelson. So I'm Bushra Soub, a senior at King's Academy, and the question reads, recently, Saudi Arabia, among other oil-producing states, released long-term plans to reduce dependency on oil. As reserves seem to be shrinking and economies try to diversify, what impact, if any, will this have on both democracy and the geopolitics in the Middle East, especially for big petrostates like Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Well, it's hard to tell what impact it'll have. It's going to depend on how it's implemented. The plans that the Saudis came out with, this Vision 2030, are very impressive on paper. What's not impressive is the way they were created, with a bunch of high-paid American consultants and a very small group of Saudi officials close to the royal family sitting in a hotel and coming up with these plans with virtually no consultation widespread among Saudi nationals. So the mechanism by which this plan was created, to me, is not very impressive and perpetuates the problem that we've suffered in the Arab world, which is leaderships making big policies without really consulting their people. You see this all over the region, and it's a problem that has to be addressed. But the actual plan is very sensible, is to cut down reliance on the government, reduce reliance on oil income, increase productivity in the private sector, create more jobs, and have citizens pay for more of their services rather than have everything subsidized by the government. The basic ABCs of the plan are just incredibly sensible, and I support them completely. I'm not sure that the Saudi Arabian government has the managerial competence to be able to do this, because it hasn't also yet consulted its own people about the price that people are going to pay in terms of higher fees and higher costs for food and electricity and other things like that. I wish them well. I want them to succeed, because a revised, reformed Saudi Arabian economy would be an incredibly powerful, positive force for the whole region. My difficulty is that this mechanism that is going ahead in Saudi Arabia remains a elite-driven, non-participatory process, and we'll have to see if that actually works or not. I hope it does work, and I encourage the Saudis to keep moving in this direction, but engage their citizens more on how to do this, and for everybody's benefit, stop this ridiculous war in Yemen, which is creating unbelievable problems in the region, with tens of millions of new people who need to be fed and given water because their country is being devastated. So there needs to be serious adjustments made in different aspects of Saudi foreign and domestic policy, but that's up to the Saudis to make these decisions. We can just give our opinions here and there, but these are sovereign decisions, and I wish the Saudis well.
Another question via chat. We'll move from the East Coast of the US to London, from King's College in London. And the question is this: you mentioned that some of the major grievances of the past were Western military interventions. How can similar sentiments be avoided this time around in Syria, for instance? So this relates to Western military meddling in the region. How can it be avoided going forward?
The problem in Syria is that everybody is fighting in Syria, from the Russians and the Iranians and the Saudis and the Turks and the Americans and the British and occasionally the Dutch send the F-16 or whatever it is, F-32, whatever they are, wherever they've reached in the F numbers these years. That everybody is fighting in Syria. It's unbelievable. It's the biggest proxy war in the modern history of the world, I think. So this is a sign of the underlying vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the Arab world, that sovereignty and political governance and economic growth and social equity have been so vulnerable and thin in so many Arab countries that it's opened the space. For people to intervene more than they did in the past. So I think the answer to Syria is going to take some years to come about, and in the end, the Syrian people are going to have to decide how they're going to put their country back together, which they will, I think, but in a different form than it was before. The separate issue of foreign intervention will only be resolved when Arab systems of governance and economic growth develop enough efficacy and credibility to be able to manage our societies in a decent way, so that our citizens are proud and happy with what they have in their countries and don't have to turn to external sources of support or get to bring in foreign militias or foreign governments and to fight their battles for them. I believe that will happen. I'm optimistic about the ability and the desire of the 400 million people in the Arab world to actually make this transition to a peaceful, democratic, pluralistic, and productive trajectory for our societies. I believe it will happen, and we've seen so many positive things happen across the Arab world. You know, in 1930 there were 60 million Arabs. There's now 400 million. Most of them have been given the chance to go to school and to get basic health care. This is extraordinary. The amount of positive development that's happened in the Arab world in a short period, relatively short period of time, is really impressive, but it hasn't been sustainable and it hasn't been equitable. And this is the problem. In the last 30 years, there's been great disparities and polarization, with a lot of poor people and a small number of very wealthy people, and foreign intervention, and all of these things, Arab-Israeli tensions, all of these things coming together have brought us to the situation we're in today. But we shouldn't forget the many positive developments that we've experienced in the trajectory of modern Arab national development over the last 70 or 80 years or so, and to build on those things while addressing the weaknesses.
Let's turn back to Kings in Jordan. You guys have some questions, I understand, yourselves, students.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll begin with our first question from Bushra.
So, Professor Khouri, you spoke about the importance of political participation.
The
I think
importance of
yes.
what? Sorry, can you get closer to the mic?
Yeah, of political participation and the importance of political involvement on the citizen
Yes.
level. So an example from Jordan, I mean, 2 days ago, I read an article that stated that less than 40% of Jordanian citizens they stated that they would vote. And so,
Yes.
so that, when these people were asked the reason why they were not planning to vote, they said that because the parliament in Jordan in the past and the status quo, the parliament has not been really contributing to the society. The role of the parliament did not change any policies, did not have any impact, and did not voice out the opinions and the voices of the people of Jordan. So
Yeah.
what do you think? What do you think? So the status quo, I believe, has been deterring people from engaging politically. What do you think could be done to change that on the citizen level? How could we make people more caring towards, engaging in the politics of their communities?
Well, this is an issue that I've dealt with and thought about and participated in as a Jordanian for the last, 40 years or so. And I remember the first elections we had in, I think it was '89. It was after the suspension of the parliament back in whenever it was in the '50s or '60s. The revival of the elections in '89 was a very exciting moment, and people got out and voted, and there was like 20 political parties and 50 new newspapers. There was a great thirst for political and socioeconomic participation, and there was great pluralism. It was a great credit to Jordan and the late King Hussein that the Muslim Brothers were there, and the leftists were there, and the communists were there, and the Arab nationalists and the tribal groups. Everybody was there, and this is the strength that Jordan still has. It has its tensions, but it still has a strength that you can, if you go around your classroom and your classes at King's Academy, you'll find people from all kinds of different backgrounds and systems or whatever. So the first thing that needs to be done is to consult more widely among the Jordanian people in terms of getting their ideas about how to make the political system more credible. The second thing is to look at other models. A national parliament sitting in Amman may not be the best way to do this because it clearly hasn't generated a lot of credibility. It's been going on since the '50s, and it's just not really working as efficiently as it could. And therefore, you're getting discussions now in the government. I know they're talking about, evolving to a different system with maybe two different houses of parliament, or local governance, regional government. That's the way to go, I think. Regional government strikes me as an important a decentralizing government, putting more authority in the hands of regional councils or even municipal councils, where individual citizens are much more in touch with the officials that they vote, elect, or throw out of office, and accountability can be much more significant. So there's many options that people have. The important thing is to engage a wide number of Jordanians in an honest, open discussion about, well, what are the options? And which ones would be the most effective? And I think this will happen because people are frustrated. And when you get, I think it was 37% was the turnout in the elections. That's pretty low. It's not actually much different than what you get in many American elections, but there's different reasons for that. But the desire of Jordanians to be involved politically is clear, but they still haven't figured out the mechanisms to do it. Political parties haven't worked very well. They're mostly, personality-based. You have a leader, tribal or ideological or whatever, and they haven't worked very well as political parties. So there has to be an exploration of other mechanisms to do this.
We'll go back to King's shortly. There's another question from Washington, Professor Khouri. I'm paraphrasing it, but would an isolationist stance on the part of the United States towards the Middle East promote peace in the region or not?
I don't think isolationism is really realistic these days. The world economic system, the trade, the flow of people, the communications, there's so many things that are interrelated now that it's hard to be isolationist. So what you need is not isolationism, but a more equitable participation by the United States, a more equitable involvement, and more law-abiding. The United States can't go around zapping people and killing them with drones anywhere it wants in the world and saying, well, we have the right to do this. The Israelis do the same thing. They kill people, detain people, lay siege to them and say, well, it's for our self-defense. Well, you have the right to self-defense, of course, all of us do, but we all should operate within the law. So what you want is the United States involvement and policies by every government, including Arab governments and Israel and everybody, that respects the law, at the same time gives opportunities for average citizens to be involved in the changes that they must bring about, to bring about what we want, which is peace and justice and development and prosperity and well-being, and ending these legacies of polarization and conflict and warfare. So I think the United States needs to be engaged more equitably, like it did, for instance, in Northern Ireland and Iran. Those were two great examples of how the U.S. did participate in a political and diplomatic process based on rules of equity, equality, and the rule of law. And they were beautiful success stories. And we ask ourselves why the United States cannot apply those same principles when it comes to Arab-Israeli issues.
But just following up on this, you mentioned the proliferation of foreign powers who have intervened militarily in Syria. But how would one de-escalate the involvement of the foreign powers without further complicating the situation? The U.S. wants to be in there because they don't want those backing the regime to win, and they don't want ISIS to gain territory. The Russians and the Iranians don't want to see the regime fall. How can you have a simultaneous or coordinated de-escalation when the stakes are so high?
Well, the only way that's going to happen is for a legitimate indigenous Syrian mechanism of governance to take over. And that's asking a lot right now, because Syria is very badly divided. There's about 1,000 different small groups who are operating militarily. You have ISIS, you have Nusra and its offshoots, you have the Kurds, you have the government. And so there's like 6 major different groups, and the Free Syrian Army and the nationalist opposition and the Islamist opposition. So there's about 6 distinct different major groups who have power and control territory in Syria. Out of that process, some unified national government system has to emerge. The Syrian people will have to decide that, and it's going to take them some time, perhaps. Once the foreign powers, the Americans, the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians, the Saudis, others, when they get tired of involving themselves militarily in Syria and only leading to destruction and death and massive, dehumanization of the Syrian people, that when people get tired of that, they'll probably say, okay, let's find a political solution. And this is what happened in Northern Ireland. This is what happened in South Africa. It just happened in Colombia. So it'll happen eventually in Syria as well. And that's when the Syrians will have to come together and come up with a system. And only then will foreign military involvement recede.
Over to Kings.
Yes.
Hello, Professor Khouri, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So as you said, the issue of Palestine has been the sort of epicenter towards the Middle Eastern problem throughout the last 68 years. However, ever since 48, Palestine has not retaken a single square inch of land promised to them by the UN or international force. And in fact, they've been losing even more land due to settlements and walls. So this kind of brings a question about the future of Palestine. Is the two-state solution dead or unviable? Are we looking at a one-state prospect, or is there still hope to establish a two-state solution?
Oh, I think there's still hope, but hope is a long-term process. There's no hope right now under Netanyahu and Abu Mazen and the condition in the Arab world and the condition of the global leaders, there's no hope right now in the next year or two of a serious negotiated resolution of this conflict. But I think there is long-term hope. There was just a poll in Israel and Palestine about 3 months ago showing that even today, a small majority of Israelis and Palestinians would want a negotiated two-state solution. The majorities of people in the Arab world and Israel clearly accept reasonable compromises that are implemented by both sides. What people don't accept is that we give the Israelis whatever they want, and the Israelis force the Americans to give them whatever they want, and we just have to go along with the red lines that the Israelis draw. That's the approach that the American government and Dennis Ross and Kissinger and others have applied for the last 40, 50 years, which is we have to make the Israelis feel comfortable, give them money, give them security, give them whatever they need, and then they will be reasonable in negotiations. Well, it didn't work, but it did work with Jordan and Egypt. Why did those peace agreements work and persist? Because the Israelis and the Jordanians and the Israelis and the Egyptians applied absolutely equal rights to both sides and implemented the rule of law and international conventions and UN resolutions. And that's why Jordan and Israel achieved peace, and Israel and Egypt achieved peace, because the two sides were seen as having equal and simultaneous rights. That same process has not been applied to the Palestinians or the Syrians or the Lebanese by the Israelis. So this is, I think, still to come. I think it will happen one day. The majority of Israelis are decent, reasonable people. The majority of Israeli leaders are not decent, reasonable people. They're extremist killers. Well, not killers, but they're rough people who do terrible things. And now they're going around shooting any Palestinian who they don't particularly like, or they think he may be dangerous. They shoot him dead before anything happens. So you've had like 280 Palestinians killed in the last year, and this is going on more and more. So yes, there is hope. The two-state solution is the only one I think that would work. One state is not ever going to work, I don't think. But it's not going to happen until you get more effective Israeli and Palestinian leaders, more engaged and dynamic Arab and Islamic leaders supporting the Palestinians, and more powerful and even-handed international mediation. Those things will happen one day, and I believe they're going to be speeded up because more and more people understand now that the continuing Arab-Israeli conflict has been the longest-running, most destabilizing, and most radicalizing force in the modern Middle East since the 1930s, not just 48. It started really in the 1930s. So I think people realize that if we can solve the Arab-Israeli conflict equitably for both sides, it's not going to instantly solve everything in the Middle East, but it's certainly going to reduce the tensions in many places and allow other things to happen more constructively around the region and lower the temperature of citizen anger across the region. I've written about this quite a bit over the years, and the indirect linkages and the direct linkages between the continuing Arab-Israeli conflict and the problems and tensions we have across the Arab world, those are all clear linkages. And we need to understand that resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict would be a major boost to reducing tensions in the region and then helping people move on to resolving those separate issues that are involved in individual Arab countries internally, or tensions like, for instance, between Iran and Israel, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and other problems in the region.
We're running out of time, but I did want to have one more question taken from chat, which I'll ask, and then turn it over for a last question from Kings. And the question from chat comes from Washington, and it relates to borders and divisions in the region. And the question is, the Iraqi state was the creation of colonial powers dividing land for their own purposes. Even as ISIS is being beaten back, different groups within Iraq have increasingly advocated for separation within Iraq. Can and should Iraq be partitioned? Indeed, many of these borders were created over a century ago by colonial powers. Have these borders outlive their usefulness as far as you're concerned? And will there have to be redesignation of borders along ethnic or sectarian lines?
I would say, first of all, that this is an issue that is universally being addressed by people. People are asking about Catalonia and about Scotland and about different parts of the world where local people might want to break away from the bigger country that they've belonged to for many years. So these are challenges to really about statehood and national identity that are being addressed much more widely. In the Arab world, they're particularly dramatic because the fragmentation of the central state has led to militarized sectarian conflict. So you get Sunnis and Shiites and Alawites and Druze and Kurds and all these people fighting each other, and therefore people say, well, these states don't work. Well, the United States didn't work very well in 1860 either. They had a big civil war, but then they figured out how to fix these issues, and they're still addressing these issues today in the United States. The Tea Party, for instance, was a big driver of the debate about local power versus federal power. So this kind of discussion will go on forever in most countries. In the particular case of Iraq and Syria and the Arab world, I believe it's up to the people of those countries to answer that question. I believe that Syria and Iraq will remain, and Yemen and Libya, will remain as sovereign states in the way that we've known them, but the internal configuration of power among their people will change. You'll have more decentralized power. So you'll have like the American or the German systems or federal systems, but the local states have a lot of power, including police, taxation, judiciary, etc. And I believe we're going to move into that kind of trajectory as well in Arab countries. It's possible that some states will not last. Or Sudan, split up. South Sudan broke off, not very happily today, but you had Yemen break up in the past and come back together. The West Bank used to be part of Jordan, but it no longer is. So there are instances where countries have lost part of their territory. If it's a will of the people themselves, then we should let that happen.
Okay, we have time for one last question. I'd like to turn it over to King's Academy in Jordan.
Thank you, Nelson. Professor Khouri, I know this is probably going to be a cliche question, but so excuse me. But as being from the youth population, what do you think are the most effective methods that we as youth can take in order to at least better the community satisfaction and the development of our communities and enlarge the Middle East?
You mean the message that you should give, or the message that I would give to you?
The message we should give.
Yeah, the message you should give, and I've dealt with youth issues for years and years around the region. The message you should give is that you're not youth, you're citizens. You're young citizens. And that the rights and responsibilities that shape your life are the rights and responsibilities of citizens. And the fact that you're young is fascinating, but really quite incidental, because the issues, the challenges, the threats, the vulnerabilities, the promise, all the good and bad things that shape your life are exactly the same things that shape the life of adults in Jordan and across the Arab world. There's only one or two areas, based on polling over the last 30 years that I've studied, only one or two areas where young people have a very different view than adults, and it's mostly related to the desire to immigrate, which is completely understandable. If you graduate from high school and college and you can't get a decent job, then you're going to try to go overseas, whereas your parents or older people are settled and they don't really have the option or the need maybe to do that. So the big message that you should deliver is that you are citizens who have rights and responsibilities, and you are eager and willing to exercise both of those things. And you are determined to work peacefully and politically and constitutionally to make sure that all Jordanians, young, middle-aged, and old, can be actively involved in bringing about the changes in their society that need to be made to achieve the goals that we all want, which is stability, prosperity, equity, social justice, peace, a good life. So I believe it's very important for young people to to be more dynamic and find the ways in society where you can work actively. It may not be through national elections. It may be simply to create a better student council in your school and to be engaged with your administration and teachers on making decisions collectively and discussing, make your school a model of the wider challenges in society. If you can't do it at the school level, just do it in your classroom, and you know, be the example of the power and the beauty of collective interaction, consultation, leading ultimately to better decision making, and it's based all on one simple principle, which the Americans called in their constitution the consent of the governed. You're not in a governance situation in school. You're students, and there's teachers and adults and administrators, but you're in a situation of interacting with people in your unit, whether it's your class or your school. Make that a model of how all the people in this circle can work together to improve life for everybody in this circle. And that's, I think, one of the greatest things that young people can do today, which is to work at their community level, their village, maybe even just their home. And this is tough because you live in Jordan as a kind of patriarchal conservative society, and most of the Middle East is like that. But the West was like that 150 years ago. You know, France and Ireland and Georgia and Oklahoma were like that 150 years ago. So we're not facing anything new. There's no new challenge that we're facing other than the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is unique to our region. But all the other challenges we face are things that are pretty universal. So I think it's critical for your generation to play your role and make it clear that you are willing and able to participate in the work that must be done to bring about those great goals that we all aspire to, that are in the end universal goals.
Right. Well, we've pretty much run out of time, but I did want to give you a grand total of 30 seconds, Professor Khouri, if you had any wrap-up comments before we sign off.
Thank you very much, Nelson. The only thing I would say is that I would encourage all of the participants in this process, the students, the professors, the administrators in Jordan and around the world, to see this as just a jumping off point to do other things. Because if you just have an occasional event like this, it's really interesting. I learn a lot. Hopefully we all learn from each other. But I think this should be seen as the beginning of an ongoing process. So it's important for instance, the students to sit down and discuss this in the next few days. So, well, okay, what do we learn from this process? Where do we agree with this guy? Where do we disagree with him? Are there important values and principles here that we can all continue to foster and to develop and to actually bring about what we want? Because it's striking how much time we spend talking about problems and challenges and threats. But the reality is that the solutions to all of those things are within us, particularly within young students in the Arab world, and especially well-educated young students in countries like Jordan, who have more potential capabilities than anybody else in the Arab world, because they've got human talent, they've got a relatively open society, and they have the incentive to solve their challenges. So I wish you all well. I thank you for this opportunity, and I'd be happy to engage with you anytime again in the future.
Terrific. Well, with that, I would call that tempered or cautious optimism.
Yes.
I want to thank first the participants who listened in, many of whom sent in questions via chat. Thanks very much for taking advantage of our chat room to make this more interactive. I want to thank in particular King's Academy for stepping up to the plate and hosting this, and for their interaction and their very good questions. They're in a particularly interesting region, of course. This is extremely relevant to them, and as you mentioned at the outset, there were elections, I think it was, you said yesterday, in Jordan itself. So democracy is indeed underway there. And I want to especially thank Professor Khouri for taking time out from his schedule in the United States to speak to us. As I said early on, this is a real expert. News Decoder is honored to have you, and we'll be posting the full replay of this session on our website in the next day or so, and I'll be spreading that URL around, and then we'll be circulating a shorter version of it to the public probably next week. So I want to thank everyone who's participated, especially Professor Khouri, and wish you all a very good day wherever you are. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.